record. All right, cool. I'll share my screen again, and this is the algorithm for the day. Let's highlight one. It's called ParensValid. Okay. So what this is saying is it says create a function that, given an input string, okay? So a function that's going to be given something, okay? So if a function is going to be given something, that means when we define the function, we might need a parameter, okay? I'm going to say these things slowly, okay? It's good to get in the habit of this. I might repeat myself 1,000 times, but that's okay. It's really so to really hammer it in, okay? So create a function that, given an input string, right, it returns a Boolean, okay? If you know what a Boolean is, it's true or false. Boolean is like true or false. That's what a Boolean is. An integer is like a number, right? So these are all data types. Integers are numbers like 1, 2, 3, right? A float is a decimal number like 1.5, you know, 3.5, and string is like, you know, a bunch of characters inside of quotation marks, right? A Boolean is true or false. This is what a Boolean is. So it's a function that is going to be given an input string, and it returns a Boolean whether the parentheses in the string are valid. So let me actually make this big, and then let me do this. Well, okay, cool. All right, cool. Here we go. So this part right here, parentheses valid, create a function that, given an input string. So create a function that can be given an input string. So just from this part right here, okay, we know that we want to create a function. Let's call the function ParensValid, right? And is this function going to be given anything?
Yes.
Yes, right? Yes. Right here,
string.
right? And some type of string, right? Okay. We can name the string whatever we want. Maybe we can name it input string, because that kind of makes sense for what it's supposed to represent. I could name this garbanzo beans if I really wanted to, right? I don't have to name it input string. Just wanted to clarify that. Cool. So it's going to be a function that is going to be given an input string. This is all we got from just reading this part right here, right? And it returns a Boolean whether parentheses in string are valid or not. So it's going to be some code here, right? Some code here. And then it's going to return a Boolean. Return either true, and then returns either true or false. Let's say true or, and remember, it has to be capital T and capital F for true and false. This is a comment though, so it really doesn't have to be anything because it doesn't matter what a comment is, right? But if I was to actually return something, it would need to be true or false, right? So it's going to be some code here. It's going to return true or false, right? Oops. So this part, you know, we didn't have to do any problem solving or even thinking about the algorithm. We just knew what this function is supposed to have, at least in terms of input string, right? And what it's going to return. So now let's look at the problem. Let's examine the problem and let's describe the problem here. And I want you guys to go through those steps that we talked about, like brainstorming and then pseudocoding that brainstorm and then actually coding out the pseudocode, right? Those steps from the last 2 days. I want you guys to practice that today. But what this says is a valid sets of parentheses. So yeah, it returns a Boolean whether parentheses in a string are valid or not, right? And our string is going to be represented by input string. So if I were to call ParensValid, this function, and I were to pass in some string with, you know, some parentheses like this, is this a valid set of parentheses? Well, let's find out. Valid sets of parentheses always open before they close. Okay. Does this in this string, do the parentheses open before they close?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, cool. So that's valid, right? So that would mean it's valid. What about this one? Would this be valid?
No.
No, right? It opens before it closes. Okay. So it needs to open before it closes, right? Okay. Needs to open before closing. And then, for example, right? For example, in this one, right? There's the open one right here. Okay, that's cool. And there's another open one, and there's a closed one, and this closed one is for this open one right here. And then there's a open one, and there's a closed one right here. Okay, and then there's a closed one, and this closed one corresponds to this open one right here. Okay, cool. So that would return true. Given something like this, there's an open one, and a closed one. That would return false, right? Because not every parentheses is closed, right? So this open one is not being closed anywhere. Only this one's being closed, right? So there's a couple of reasons for it to be invalid, right? If it opens before closing, right? If it opens before closing, and also, what about in this one? This opens before closing, and this opens too, but is this valid?
No.
No, right? So if there's uneven amounts of open versus close, right? Because there's two opens and then one close, so that's definitely not valid. So in order for it to be valid, it needs to have an even amount of opening and closing, and it needs to if it opens before closing. No, if it closes before. So if these things happen, it should be false, right? If these things happen, if it closes before opening, like such as like this, closing before opening, something like this, or if it opens, right, or if it just has uneven amount, it should be invalid. So these are two reasons that it could be invalid, right? And in order to brainstorm, you can ask yourself, you can give yourself a set of parentheses. I mean, some type of string to look at, right? Something like this. If we were to look at this, Jesus. Okay. N O P. Okay, cool. This one, is this valid or not? Without having to code at all, just by looking at it.
It's not.
It's not, right? And we can tell, so when you looked at it, you were like, you probably looked at the string and you looked at each item, you're like, okay. You saw open one, you're like, okay, there's an open one. So you kept track of how many open ones you saw so far. And you go, this one, is this a parentheses? No. Is this a parentheses? Oh, yes, it's an open one. Okay, there's another, now that we have two open ones. You kept track of two open ones. And there's like, oh, here's a closing one. Okay, cool. So there's a closing one. So I'm expecting another closing one. If I don't get it, we know it's false. So when you looked with your eyes, did you have to go through this whole string to examine each character to see what kind of parentheses it was?
Yes.
You did, right? So slow down that process of how you figured out that this was invalid, without coding, and then think about that process of what your eyes did and what you did, and write down those steps and see if you could translate them into code. Okay, I'm gonna let you guys do that. This is a difficult one for many people, especially in the beginner realm, right? And it's, just go through that process of getting engaged and trying to problem solve and maybe diagram it out, talking to other people about it. Just at least if you do that, you'll work out your brain towards this type of thinking. And if you end up getting to a solution and getting the solution, awesome. And if you don't, that's fine too. You still engage that part of your brain. You had that workout in the morning for your brain in terms of left brain workout. This is just a left brain workout. Okay. If building applications and stuff was like, learning Python syntax, learning how to use Django, learning how to build web apps. If that's like, let's say that's like a sport that you play. Let's say you play a sport, right? Soccer. So you have to dribble the ball and you have to be good with the soccer ball, right? That's like being good with the language, like Python, Django, and the frameworks, right? But the algorithm, that's like, if you play soccer, if you also worked out your legs, lifted weights, then you'll just be a faster, stronger player. So whatever your skills are, it'll make them even more. It'll make your skills shine even more so, right? So then these algorithms are kind of like the workouts, or these algorithms are like the vegetables to a healthy coding diet, right? They'll build that muscle. They'll build that left brain muscle, so it'll help you to become a better developer in general. Like, you know, those algorithms like for minimum and maximum, there's already built-in functions like min of some array. It'll, you know, this will automatically give me the minimum in an array. But we made you code out the functions to create a minimum, to find the minimum, and to code out the function to create a max, to find the maximum in those fundamental exercises, right? Because there's this exercises, left brain exercises. We're going to be building web apps starting in Flask and also in Django for the rest of this month, right? But we want to work out those left brain muscles and learn that syntax first. So I'm gonna put you guys into your breakout rooms. And is there any questions on the requirements for this algorithm before we get started? Okay, cool. I'm gonna stop screen sharing. I'm gonna